And today I'm really, really excited to introduce our esteemed speaker, who happens to be my mentor. So what's very cool about this is that Pam has watched me throughout my career progress, and she's been the person that I've gone to when it comes to what should I ask for in my next performance review? What do I need to look out for as I negotiate my next position and opportunity? What kind of skills do you think that I should work on to improve? And so she's seen me go from, I don't know if I can sell, to head of marketing and business development for a really successful boutique startup. So, it's been really, really cool to have her aligned to how I've grown. But I'm also really excited because I know I get to ask questions of her, because I know her so well once she's done telling her story, that are going to really help you guys in thinking through what it is that you need to do as your careers progress and as you're thinking through what it is that you want to be when you grow up. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Pam. We'll let you get started with introducing yourself, how you came to be a multi-founder of many, many startups, many, many initiatives, and then we'll get into a bit of a fireside chat. Okay?
Terrific. So, hello, ladies. I hope everyone is doing well. And while I do, and I thank Paula for all her kind comments, it's really easy to mentor superstars. So, but I think that the part that we did was explaining to her the power of sales in anything you do. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be a bag-carrying, cold calling person, but a characteristic of having some kind of embedded, even light touch sales makes business development, makes client service, makes being an entrepreneur, also makes being a peer and a coworker incredibly important, because, I don't think we realize that through all of our lives, kind of everything we touch is influencing something for either ourselves, our families, our mentors, our coworkers. So I'm Pam Cytron, and I had a little different journey and very little mentorship in life as a child as well as business. But I have to say that from my generation, I was very fortunate to have a lot of male mentors. And I want to make sure that as we look at the power that we have, that we should not be only having mentors that may be men, but we should also look to young men to mentor as well, because we have that. So I started my career as a telemarketing, well, actually as a receptionist, and then moved into cold calling. And I loved cold calling. And to this day, when I have a bad day, I cold call because it makes me feel really alive. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do that in this world of not being able to have contact on a human level. And then I got the opportunity to go into sales management, right? But having spent my career talking to people about opportunities and their problems was what enabled me to find other solutions to build. So there was one in the back office. And then I started talking about data really early. Realized that in unstructured data, there's all kinds of insights. I always tell people, when we think about data, we should think about TJ Maxx and Bloomingdale's, because TJ Maxx is like unstructured data. We go there, we look for the treasure, right? And it's the treasure that we find there that may be in our closet the longest. Where structured data, you walk into Bloomingdale's and everything's right on the rack. We know what department we need to go to for our makeup or for our shoes or for any of that. So I always try to parallel those things. And as the world was starting to talk about data and all these data warehouses that came up, it was the ability to say, you know what, these conversions fail because we're using dirty data. So that led to my next process, which was building a data company. And in that journey, ladies, I've had success and failure, which has led to what I'm doing now, which I have the great pleasure of helping build and overseeing a nonprofit that is focused on helping early stage companies. At the moment, we're focused 100% on wealth tech. And somebody asked me last night, I got to speak at University of Texas to the girls business group, had almost 150, 200 girls that were either freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors, just like an unbelievable room of women. And they had asked a question about what made me start this new venture on a nonprofit. And it was because some of the experiences that I ran into as an entrepreneur, and I would also say a female entrepreneur, I wanted to make sure that no one experienced again, that maybe they'll make a lot more mistakes, but if someone could avoid the mistakes that I've made, sometimes myself and sometimes indirectly, and seeing things I could have changed. So I'm having a ball running the accelerator, getting growth companies in there, and helping future entrepreneurs live their dream and build technology within the financial services area. And I sit on a couple boards and, do a little things, but
yeah, no,
I like
and so
to help.
we'll get into that too, because I think the board seats, I think that's something that everybody in kind of that mid-range of their career, then they start to think, okay, well, what's the next thing that I should do? And there's a couple of things. It's publications and or boards, right, to begin to get the visibility and credibility. But I want to go back a little bit to some of your early days, because a lot of people experienced different elements of, and a lot of folks that probably tuned in from our network here is intelligent automation or automation, back office automation. And you did the OG back office automation, right, at your time. So I'd love for you to tell a little bit about your early days in New York, Wall Street, and helping people understand what the inception of back office optimization was before we got into all this robot AI land. It was helping people understand structured data. So talk a little bit about that, because that's still what we're talking about today, by the way. People just call it different, call it a different name.
Oh, yeah.
We're still talking about structuring data, though. So tell us a little bit about the origin stories of AI, because you saw it, lived it, breathed it.
Well, let me go back a little bit. So when it was politically correct, people used to call me the back office broad. In fact, even which was Tab at the time, they changed my username to say back office broad. They couldn't do that today, but I wear that badge with pride. But for anybody that's been selling, let's leave the workflow aside for a second, in that back office, okay? I was doing 30 to 40 new sales a year, okay, to enterprises. I mean, to think of such a thing today is like, no, that can't be true. Okay. And that had a lot to do with how people bought, but it also had to do a lot with the transformation, somewhat of the magnitude that we're going through now with some different tools. So, back in the early 90s, there was a lot of different back office systems. There was one for wealth. There was one for insurance. There was one. Everybody kind of had their own from a Wall Street perspective, right? And at the end of the day, what do I own? What's it worth? What's my counterparty risk? Like inventory, like traders were doing, right? Traders always had the inventory, but the back office was like, okay, we got to bring this in. And it was days, right? I mean, we would have service level agreements would say, okay, you'll close my books by 30 days after month end. I mean, can you imagine? Right. So there was a big transformation. And I mean, I'm sure you guys are familiar with SS&C, right? SS&C Technologies. SS&C Technologies started with a product that was my first job. I was 20 years old, or my second job, but, and I had been at SunGuard before that. But this is how old I am. But the first product they came out with was Camera, right? Which we don't even hear that name anymore, right? And that built that. But let me rewind a little bit more just to show you how old I am, right? But the biggest companies in the world, when we were making that transformation to the SS&Cs, to the Princeton Financials, which is now State Street, to the Temenoses, to all those products that we were doing, all of us were doing all these deals a year, right? And it was segmented by industry, it was segmented by country, it was segmented by what kind of reports they put out, right? Insurance companies needed Schedule D, European companies needed IFRS. That all still exists today, okay? But what happened is that companies grew, companies merged, companies did this. So all of a sudden they had 1, 2, 3, 4. So when you guys go in today and say, how do I automate, right? You're still touching those systems. Mm-hmm. But you've got to understand, back in the early 90s when this transformation happened, this was state of the art. But again, it was coming into, it was because of the technology. We were moving, the transformation was mainframe to PC, mainframe to mid-range. Okay, so they were doing it based on architecture and a cost, but the cost was infrastructure. It was not about the client. It was not about the deliverable. It was reducing. And did they get some functional benefits? Absolutely. But did they get integration? Did they get that one part of the organization can look at the same data through the lens of a lawyer, but the other part of the organization could look at the lens of an accountant, but then you could use that same data to do marketing? Okay. That didn't exist. And the solution to that was going to be the data warehouse.
Mm-hmm. Which had to turn into a pond, lake, and ocean at this point.
Right. I used to go, I'm like, I don't know why we call it, a data lake. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a big lake person myself, but what do you find in a lake? Shoes, dirt, right? So even at the beginning, we labeled it something that was already going to make it a dump.
A swamp. Yeah.
So anyway. So that's a little bit of it. So, but then as you looked, as technology got better, as we built these data warehouses, understanding that what we were doing was we were taking this data and making it static.
Yes.
Right. So that was the other problem. Right. So, I know we fear the robotics. I know we fear all of that. This is just another evolution that's going to make these things great. But I mean, the amount of deals that we were doing, I mean, if you think about SS&C, if you think about Princeton Financial, which is now State Street, if you think about, the FISs of the world, those guys gobbled up. But then what did they do? They acquired all kinds of other companies for interoperability to solve a function, right? And then it became not a custom solution or not that energy to be able to interact. So does that answer kind of where you were asking me to go, Paula?
And not only that, but so a lot of, so WonderBotz, so the company I work for now, was built on helping resell and implement Blue Prism, which now, in the last 3 years, I think it was acquired by SS&C Technologies. So while these behemoths continue to exist, they've been trying to solve the same problem and continue to have M&A activity to, answer and find what today's solution is to that. And at the end of the day, I think there's still data that needs to be understood. And like you said, transient data, right? Active data, current data that's live, so that we're not looking at it from each way. So when you started,
let me add thing though. The one thing though that happens with a Blue Prism, because I worked with Blue Prism when they were new and cool, and we were doing it with my startup. The challenge with some of these acquisitions, whether it's, and this is not a fault of them, this is just fact, okay, is that when they buy them, they're buying them for greed. They're buying them to make everything better, right? But they don't put the integration effort into it. And so that what happens is this great new sexy technology, and they don't buy with the intent to say, I'm just adding. They buy with the intent to say, we're going to integrate this and we're going to do all this great stuff, but profits and markets and all that get in the way. And so that integration usually fails after years, fails in the extent that they get it kind of done, but it never has the blue ocean intent that they tried for.
No, absolutely. No, we're seeing that and living that day in and day out. But what's interesting is that, today's, to your point, some of the same companies are still trying to solve the same functions, right? And I think that's, SS&C is a great example. It's funny. I just recently met the head of intelligent automation from State Street. And so we've been talking too. So it's just funny how the cycles always connect with you and I when we talk. So remind me to tell you about that one. But, the other thing that I was going to ask you is that through this evolution that you've witnessed and you've lived and experienced, as we continue to kind of think that through, being, you're a back office broad, right? And when, heaven forbid we ever allowed to say that, today, but how did you go about using that as your superpower rather than, seeing it as a weakness or anything like that? I personally can't ever see you in any capacity of being fragile at work, but you had to be a tough cookie, back in the day. So tell us a little bit about that, how you overcame, maybe a male counterpart or a woman, that was maybe trying to vie for the seat at the table, which there weren't very many. But how did you overcome the adversity of any, gender disparity in your career?
Well, first of all, I think I've been pretty lucky overall, right? But I think it's not about the other thing. It's about some of your personal boundaries. And, my childhood was a little less normal than some. And so I had boundaries and barriers up really early. So I think that helped. But I think that the boundaries that you create are not just your personal boundaries. It's also the ability, I used to, when I would go to trade shows, I would stay at a different hotel. there's just little things that you would put in. I think that honestly, how you overcome that with your peer women was harder than the men.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I have great aspiration and great faith that the younger generation of girls, Paula, like you, like probably many of the people on this phone who don't see gender the same way, who don't see color the same way, I don't think there's going to be an event. I mean, since Gloria Steinem, we've been trying to fix all these problems. Okay. And even if you look back then, I think it was the lack of support that women truly give each other. I mean, we go to clubs and we go to this and we all act really happy and like we're doing things, but we really didn't reach out and pull somebody up. I asked a panel the other day who were talking about all the stuff that they were doing for women, and I'm like, how many have you hired? You, not your company, you. But I do believe that, the peers, right? I mean, the other thing is if we think about dating, right? I mean, we know men, right? So we actually have to make men feel comfortable. And I think that's easier for some women than others. Some women have stronger girl relationships, right? So if you kind of think about where your weakness is in your personal relationships of do you have more girlfriends than you have guy friends? Now I think as a result of my history, I have more guy friends than I do girlfriends. But my work and my life at that stage was filled with that. So I think making male mentors, but I think establishing in a very professional way, but also in a joking way sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
humor certainly reduces things, that you just make sure that you're equal. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And so, but I didn't have pay disparity. But the reason I didn't have, I think, and I don't think that's because of me, I think that's because I was always in jobs that were heavily incentivized for revenue. So I always
Mm-hmm.
tied myself to a bar that was based on revenue. So where you hear about some of these pay discrepancies, which still exist, right? And we're still overcoming. If you're in a role where you can create your incentives, Paula, like we talked about, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can control that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So by my early 20s, I was buying cars with cash,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I always say that, one thing, being a girl might get you in a room, but it's not going to keep you there. So be a girl, but also show your smarts, also show your wisdom. Because once you do that, they don't see a pretty face. They don't see a gender. They only see somebody that they want to bond with and that they know when they talk to them, they're going to learn something.
Mm-hmm. And or that they're going to solve their problems, right? They're going to be an asset or an addition to it. And, I'll say this too, in echoing what you just said, I've had to say, I know what a male counterpart makes throughout my career before, and say, and you need to either match this or elevate, or I'm out of here, and
Right.
I won't say what job that was, but it was a job, and and they ultimately made it right. But it was more about being comfortable with saying what it was that my value was, and it's less about what, being fair, and more about understanding what my value is. And it's not always monetary, right? It's also sometimes being valued is about, having a voice or having, a say in what the strategy is.
Well, I think the other thing is that the data, because I like to talk about data, the data comes back and we use this data that makes us look like we're failing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And will we ever be at parity? I don't think so. Women stay home to have children. Women do this. I mean, you go into the workforce, you take a pause. So let's not try to be, the equality.
Exactly.
What's
Equal.
the
Yeah.
equality that we're searching for? I mean, 1/3 of companies around the world are started by women right now. That was a stat from 2023. And that is women between the ages of 18 and 33. Okay. If you look at the percentage of venture capital last year, okay, women aren't getting as many as men, but there's not as many startups. Sorry, ladies. I mean, I just did in our last cohort, our first cohort, we had 90 applications. Only one was from a female founder. So we have to look at all the data. But instead of going in and saying that, it's you don't have to go in and say, I know my male counterpart is making that. You can go in and say, I believe that the range relative to my qualifications are X.
Yep.
Okay.
Exactly.
Just have the data. But, during the pandemic, right? 1.4 million jobs, creating $579 billion of revenue. or created by women, right? We don't hear these things. We say, oh, they didn't get this or they didn't get that. So my ask of you and your peers and everybody else, let's start using the good data,
Yeah.
because we are a lot further along than we think we are.
Mm-hmm.
And then that also takes the fear off of others to say, oh, am I gonna have to look at something? Is she gonna be asking me
Yeah.
about these things, right? Go in and tell people, I know that this is, but start sharing that kind of data.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important because the facts speak, right? And this was moons ago, but but I'm just saying we've come a long way in being able to have these kind of conversations, to where you recognize, you don't have to, sell yourself on a sword, die on the sword, so to speak, to be able to get to where you need to go. So one of the other things that you helped me with early on was to see some of the superpowers that I couldn't see in myself. So how would you share with others, and you just spoke to some university kiddos this week too, but how would you teach, or what are some tactical, applicable advice that folks can use to kind of look inward and see what it is that they should learn more of, teach themselves more of, or really harness some of the skills that they have inside? What would you say practically to
Well,
that?
first of all, I think you got to look, at your own life, your relationships, right? Your brothers or sisters, right? Do you have, and what are those things in your life? Are you the person that when you go on vacation, right, is whining or not whining? Are you the person that goes on vacation wants to get up early in the morning? Start reflecting on where the things that you've managed in your, whether you played sports, were you the greatest player, or were you the cheerleader, or were you both, right? And so if you start to look at some of those things, you can start to see where the strengths are. But right now, what I also think people need to focus on really hard at the beginning is, because of the interaction with media and the interaction with our phones and the interaction with social, we are starting to lack interpersonal skills, right? One of the tasks I gave the girls last night was, I told them to, why do you run a social? But the social isn't about a fraternity date party, right? Bring the boys' business club and the girls' business club together and practice networking.
Yeah.
How do you do it, right? So I think as we look at our superpowers, it comes from within, right? But if you don't have passion for what that is, then it's impossible to make that what you do, because I mean, we work more than we play most of the time.
Yeah.
Um, but your communication skills, Paula, how you interacted, how you had your eye. I mean, there were very certain characteristics in you that, made you be, I'm like, you have to be the outward person. There are
Mm-hmm.
internal people in organizations, and there are external people in organizations. There are
Mm-hmm.
internal people in our families. There are external people in our families.
Yep.
There are internal people in friend groups and not. So take those things that you're good at, and being an internal person is just as valuable as being an external person,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if you don't really like people, then don't go into a leadership role. Make your superpower that operational, that structure. Those are just as important qualities. And I'm not sure I articulate it, because it's a lot easier to spot it and find it. But I do think
No,
it's,
I think that's
we're born with
no,
these superpowers.
I think that's it. And maybe that's what the lesson is that you're born with certain intrinsic qualities that you might see outside of the workforce. And if you're naturally the planner on vacation, or you're naturally the person that, brings the friend groups together to make sure that, movie night happens, or whatever it is, then that probably means that you're supposed to be in some sort of an external facing role. And then I think you're right with technology, and especially after the pandemic, people got really uncomfortably comfortable with these Zoom type sessions, right? And I think it even took us kind of there was like a malaise that lasted way past the pandemic, where it took a while for us to even go back to in-person, events and meetups and stuff like that. And I think, I myself am guilty of, getting too lazy to do the extra lunch when I'm in New York. And pre-pandemic, it was 5-6 meetings a day, and I'm just like, man, it's like more than 3 meetings in New York in one day now is exhausting. So I think, you're absolutely right. We need to make time for those things, but you kind of need to recognize it from within, how you go about it. So the other thing that I wanted to ask you, because I think it's just so important, is when you're approaching a new job, and I think early career folks, can really, really benefit from this advice, because you gave it to me, and I've leveraged this every step of the way. And especially in the startup world, I mean, that's incredible. It's like a third of companies are made by women. That's pretty awesome. But how do you recommend negotiating compensation, with equity being on the table these days more and more? Even if it's a percentage, revenue, definitely from the lens of from sales. But how would you recommend somebody goes about negotiating or thinking through a creative package that would incent them and also be beneficial for the organization that they want to join?
So if we look at it through the startup lens, okay, you know, first of all, I think people take their equity in startups and don't always understand what that means. And also doesn't always understand what that exercise is. We all think, oh, it's going to be Facebook. Oh, it's going to be this. And I'm just going to be a millionaire overnight. Okay. So, but I'm very big on equity comp. Okay. And I'm going to say something that cash flow is the most important thing in a startup. Okay. So it depends on what time you're coming into the startup. Okay. So if you're coming into a really early startup and you want to be kind of that founding team, then your flexibility has to be really flexible, right? But you must trust, if you don't know these guys and they're bringing you in for a skill, or girls, you have to be able to say, do I trust them? Right. And then you write that to be able to tie yourself to that early success, because you may have to make great sacrifices in salary, but you want it down the road. But you have to be able to be patient to say, bump 2, bump 3, bump 4, right? But be aligned with everybody on that founding team to be taking that same journey with you, right? And if you start just about a founder he's getting it all and he's maintaining that level, that's not kind of cool, right? It's like the startup that gets $20 million and then posts the picture of a Ferrari online. Not so good. But let's just take a B company where they've got private equity money, right? And they're on this growth. This is when they start hiring people, right? They usually start hiring people after they get capital, after they go there. They've proven it out, right? And those are exciting companies. You've watched through all those stages at WonderBotz. You know what I mean? But you came in really early, right? And you had to do a couple steps to do that, right? But basically, be selfish. Measure it on your accountability and your contributions to that. And every person in an early stage company, whether you think you have responsibility for revenue or not, you do.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you've got direct responsibility, then you build it, but make the equity, but put yourself in these startups to ask for it, but align with the contribution to growth that you are going to contribute to that organization. Okay.
Yeah.
And make that milestone base, and also get the jumps, because when they get that money, listen, if you don't kind of reset yourselves when this capital comes in, and if they haven't planned for the adjustment to the people who have made some sacrifices and compromises along the way, you're going to get stuck there.
Yep.
Okay.
Nope,
So
exactly.
you have to be your own cheerleader there.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing too is that, one of the things that you had also mentioned is that when you create packages or offerings, right, then make sure that you're, hitching yourself to the revenue and ultimate outcomes that produces to the organization. So for anybody who's listening, who is maybe a developer, not a salesperson, and you think that you can't contribute to the rise of a startup in some material way, think again, because innovation is what builds startups and what yields kind of the most results for them when it comes time to have that exit strategy, which is ultimately the plan for any startup, some sort of an exit or some sort of a growth.
Well, I think I'm hoping, and I don't know if this will happen, but traditionally years ago, you would have some kind of profit sharing in companies, right? And it was a profit sharing plan, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at some of the privately held companies like First Rate, who I work for, I sit on the board, they started, having a sharing plan that everyone shared, including their community that they work and they live in. Okay.
Yeah.
And that went across the board, and 33 years later, that still exists. So while there's not equity and an exit in that, there was a design, more traditional profit sharing plan. And I'm thinking with companies staying private longer and things like that, I think that's an area that we might get back to on a little more consistency too.
No, that sounds great. So there's a question in the Q&A that's asking, how can individuals manage and process rejection within a professional setting, such as when facing a setback, like not getting a promotion? What should they do?
Well, if they thought they were getting a promotion and they didn't, then I think in that case, you got to reflect internally. What signals did I miss? Why did I think it? In that case, if it's a promotion that they were expecting, I think, it's just like when people get fired, if you're surprised, I think that you need to take a little bit of time and think inward. But the question is, I think rejection is it happens all the time. They could reject your idea, they could reject what you're doing. It's not just a position. And I think that we've all lost that ability to take constructive criticism or rejection, and don't know how to counter it. So in that case, though, ask for feedback, right? I want to improve myself. My idea wasn't great. What can I do to refine that? Because if you ask those questions back, right, you're working in an environment that's giving you that feedback. But rejection is part of life. And, being surprised about big things, bad, but ask for the feedback to be able to say, what can I do differently? And if it's happening over and over again, you have to look at the company culture. Right. You have to look at those things because, guys, not every job you're going to take is going to be the place you want to live. I mean, think about it. You spend more time at work. So what the culture is like, what your coworkers are like, what the values are like. If you're not aligned with those in your personal and professional life, you're going to be really unhappy at work.
Yes, that is true. I've lived that before. So another one that kind of came to mind as you were speaking there too is, if definitely the self-reflection, but I think it's important to revisit kind of your resume, your LinkedIn, how it is that you present yourself to the world. So how would you recommend going about kind of positioning yourself, pitching yourself, so to speak? Because you've always said that everything you do is a sales role. So what kind of advice would you give to, beefing up your resume, thinking through, how you present yourself to that next career opportunity?
Well, what I think is a great exercise, right, is do a business plan as if you were the startup, right? So when we think about what are we going to achieve? What is our mission? What is our goals? What are our activities? What do we need to do that, right? We think about pitch decks for a company. So if you write a pitch deck about yourself, right? That's the way that you look at it. And then the strengths that you're seeing that you say, this is what I'm going to do. These are the things. Then you look at what jobs you've had, right? And how do you articulate those? But your your resume should be action driven. Okay. The results. What did I do? Right. So when you go onto your LinkedIn and you look at your bullet points, you do 4 or 5 that just talks about not, I ran sales. I impacted sales by this. I don't care if you're a developer. I don't care if you're in professional services. I don't care if you work at a grocery store. Okay. I swipe more cans across that thing than anybody else. You know what I mean? So make the outcomes of your resume, make the outcomes of LinkedIn an action with action verbs.
Yep. Totally agree. So we had a question yesterday, which was yesterday's folks were also kind of in the tech space and came up from that background as well. And so one of the questions that I think would resonate really well is from you too, is, so how do you see the future of women in tech evolving? So give us a little bit more of the data, because I think that's really, really, powerful. And what changes and initiatives would you like to see implemented further? Besides conversations like this, awareness, what kind of things can we implement to see the future of women in tech evolve?
Well, I think that the biggest opportunity women in tech have is because we're all worried about AI and what that's going to be. Well, it's going to be a coworker. But the thing is that coworker is going to need to be trained. And I think naturally, and this isn't a knock on men, but naturally there's more resilience. So when I talk about women in cyber, it's like, what are our personal traits that relate to the field that we're going into? So I have a cyber event, and a women's cyber event in Arlington in June, right? And we're talking, yeah. And we're talking about, and I've got this panel that's talking about resilience in cyber, using the personal traits of a woman to look at that technology. So are we the best people to look at it? Do we protect our families? Do we protect our coworkers? So if we think about the bots, how those bots are going to be trained. Okay. Who was the first voice that we ever heard when we started getting automated messages?
Yeah, it's true. So
It was
was
women's
it
voices.
Alexa? Yeah.
Right. But
True.
even the
Oh yeah,
operators.
like on the operators. Yeah.
The operators, they were
Yeah.
all women.
Yep.
Okay. So if we think about how we're going to train the bots, okay, how we're going to do that. But I also think that there's an unfair advantage because now we have STEM programs. We have women's STEM programs. So girls are naturally going into these fields a little bit more. It comes back again to the data, supply and demand. Right? If there's not a pool of women coding, if there's not a pool of women doing cyber, it's hard to hire them. Okay. So I think that this actually starts at a younger age through the programs that we're doing in the schools, through the programs they're doing in colleges. And I actually think we're better at it in high school and below than we are in college. I have a daughter that's finished and I have a son that's there. And it blows my mind. And my son is studying computer science. Okay. So it just blows my mind some of the things that they're learning, even for finding a job. Right. So I think it's going to be a little bit easier, but I would say, use your femininity, use the things that we're good at and parallel the qualities that you have to the unintended benefits of the technology.
Yes. No, absolutely. And I think taking it to the next level, computer science, I didn't even know that was still a curriculum. What other school, I mean, what else do the schools need to do to prepare them? Because you're absolutely right. I mean, it starts there in, the awareness of what's next. So what kind of curriculums do you think that they need to come up with to get this stuff better? It's like the art of sales was such a joke. It was like an elective.
Well, it's like we're talking to one of the universities about it. They want to do a fintech certificate. Right. And so we've proposed something quite radical in that of saying it can't be academic. We'll take these kids and we'll put them in a wealth manager.
Yeah.
Not as an internship, but kind of like an internship. Okay. That says, here's the curriculum that we need to do. So if you think about kids coming out of college and they'll do a rotation in a bank.
Yeah.
And they'll do a rotation in human resources here and here and come back and say, you know what? I like this part. Or they'll go to an insurance company and I like that part. Right. So I think there needs to be more fundamental. I mean, it's just like academic founders. And if there's academic founders listening to me, and I love them all, don't get me wrong. Okay. But academic founders have trouble scaling and worrying about making that buck to say they want it to be perfect before it goes to market. And you can't. Right. And so the academic and the theory is very good, but we have to take these people. We have to take people retired. We have to get more people. Your marketing class at college usually has some guy or girl that did marketing. Okay. But your science class is some guy that's only built robots like his whole life. Right. And has never built an application. So I think it's a merging of more private companies and academics merging together to give more and I think our intern processes are broken, and I think our recruiting in the colleges are broken. And if we could look to fix those two things, I think that that'll be a good start.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, because internships kind of ended in my time of exiting college. There really wasn't much opportunity for that. You get maybe a summer program, but it would be just filing paperwork, and you'd be around the business, but not in the
business. Right.
Yeah.
But now it's even worse after COVID. I mean, I've got a son looking for an internship. He wants to go to the office. Yeah. He wants to work with people in the office.
Yeah.
And all these internships are like, oh yeah, we'll hire you, but it's online.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, and how are you going to get that water cooler experience, the discussion, the camaraderie, the collaboration?
But even colleges didn't go back to, I mean, he's got, out of all of his college classes, I think only one's in person on campus, right?
Wow.
So we got to get past all this Zoom and start having people in places and working together, because that question that we talked about, conflict and rejection, it's really hard to resolve that over a screen, because you can't see the body language. You can't see if they're nervous. You can't see anything. So I think that we've got to resolve some of that earlier question about that. Also has to be getting more human contact with people.
No, I totally agree with that. Human contact, I think, is that's what makes the world go round, truly. So one of the other things I've always admired about you is that you have an unwavering passion for what you do. Like you've known it, you've lived it, you've done back office forever. You've been the data woman since I met you and since before. How do you keep that? How do you keep like? How did you know that? How did you know that you fell into the right thing? And how do you keep your spark and passion about it when you watch this industry do this for so long and still kind of not get it right, even though we're on the precipice of AI? How do you stay motivated and passionate and keep kind of fighting for this passion project of yours?
Well, because I haven't ever had a year. I've had setbacks in time, right? But I've never had a year that you can't think of something that can be done, right? And I also think, if I look back to what my challenges were in my childhood and my challenges were in early adulthood, and that, I had to be my biggest cheerleader sometimes then, right? My biggest cheerleader now is my husband. But then, but when I didn't like something, I stopped doing it. If I didn't like my job and I didn't like where it was, I didn't wait for another job. I mean, it blew my husband's mind when we were early married. I mean, he was somewhere, and that's when you had to fax everybody. And I was just like getting really frustrated. And I was successful and I was selling, but everything around me, I mean, I don't recommend this in your 20s, but I'd send him a fax. I said, I quit today, just so you know, see you soon. And he was coming back. So I never let myself get to a point that whatever frustration I was feeling in that company let me down, because I always knew I could get another job. And if that meant waiting tables or scrubbing the floors until I found the next one, it didn't matter. There was no pride in what the job was. And I never had, it wasn't about that. And it was about helping. And when you could always see another way that it could be possible, and you had one other person that said, that makes sense,
Yeah.
right? It just keeps you going.
Yeah. No,
But if
that's
you
so
don't like what
true.
you're doing, but if you don't like what you're doing, and that doesn't mean the job, it may be the place, right? And I really believe in this day and age, the culture with which you work in. I mean, even the Goldman Sachses of the world are having trouble hiring out of Ivy League
Yeah.
because of entitlement and all these crazy things that we're going through, right? So guys, whether you graduated from an Ivy League, whether you didn't graduate from college at all, right? Like myself, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I encourage college to young girls. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that it's our own determination of what leads us. And I know we're going to run out of time because we could have a whole conversation about motherhood and working.
Yes. Well, no, and it's funny that you say that because that's the last little couple questions, and you can go as personal or as not as you want to. I know some of the impossible things that you have overcome throughout the course of your career, but one of the things that continues to come up thematically in some of the questions is how do you overcome the setback that society puts on you when you are a mother in work, right? Because it takes at least, the whole pregnancy portion and then the early days, and then you gotta breastfeed if you do that. There's a lot of just practical things that come with being a mother that take you away from the job or don't give you as much time to show up as some male counterparts. So how did that affect you at all, or did you kind of breeze through that? How was planning for a family for you?
I think my daughter's listening, so she can write in the comments if I'm telling the truth or not. One was, it's just like your business, ladies. If you're going to want the baby and you're going to want the work, you have to figure out what the team looks like. Okay. And you have to make sure that the team of dad, right, has his role in the team. And you have to make if you make a decision for childcare, internal or external, right? We don't think about it. We think about daycare really easily, but I mean, I had nannies that were coming here, going to school, who I paid a lot less than daycare, right? One of them's the head of Asian for Verizon now.
Yes,
Okay.
I love that story. You're
And
Brazilian.
and so you have to make sure that you have an infrastructure in your house, not your work, in your life, that does that. We cannot put this on our employers. Okay. And ladies, as you probably know, I mean, or some people know or don't, I've gone through cancer, right? I've been a woman in long-term recovery for 15 years. I mean, I had all that happening. I mean, I got cancer. My kids were 10 and 5, right? And it was about how we had to do that as family. And I kept working. Okay. I kept working when I went to treatment to get myself healthier. So, but I had a team, and that team was family, sometimes extended family, right? But you can't have it all. Okay. And what I'll also tell you is when they're babies, they really don't know who's around them. I mean, they're not going to remember all those trips I took my daughter on when she got a gold card on American by the time she was 2. Okay. Because I traveled with her everywhere. She doesn't remember those trips. Okay. But when they get into middle school, when they get into high school, you have blended that family. You have figured out your job because you're in a much better state. And that's when the eyes are on them.
No, I think that's so important. So you have to be the CEO of your life. It's not just at work. It's just having the infrastructure and the team, in place so that the tribe is always there. So one of the other questions that just came in, and I know we're cutting short on time. So audience, what fantastic questions you've been throwing. If you guys have any more, we have about 10 minutes left, so make sure to get them in. So one of the questions says, how do you suggest, react, or control anger when you face hidden or unspoken gender discrimination? Is perhaps there an instance you faced where you handled it wisely, or maybe you didn't handle it quite so wisely? How did you overcome that?
That was an evolution. Okay. So when I was like Paula, I would be incredibly confrontational. I would be incredibly defensive. I would be likely impolite. Okay. And the older I got, the more I realized that you embrace it with humor, and you embrace it in a different way with kindness. Okay. There's no easy answer to that question, because whether you're insulted in the business world or you're insulted in your personal life, insults immediately give us a reaction. Okay. But what I will recommend to all of you now, because it was different when I was young, don't do it in a text. Don't do any of this confrontation in an email. Okay. Because writing never goes away. Your words matter. But even if you are inappropriate, even if you are saying something, they are forgotten. Okay. And so I would resolve that with your words and your conflict, and try to do it with kindness and practice. And again, I'll come back to CEO of life and CEO of your peer life. I mean, if you are the person that's fighting all the time and wants the last word with your friends, that will come into your work. Okay. So what I say is swallow your tears and bite your tongue till it bleeds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank God that at my age, I already had you. So, I've had that biting my tongue to think those things through. And I think the only thing I'd echo, or add to that sentiment is, if it's hidden or unrecognized, maybe it's your perception. Right? Because sometimes if it's a hidden, bias or discrimination, in that format, and then you also need to be able to, if it is in the workplace, seek somebody in HR or seek your leader. Make sure that that conversation is had.
There's abusive things, guys. There's real good things, but in kind of this back and forth. But remember, if you point a finger at somebody, there's always 3 pointing back at you.
Yep.
Okay, and so don't take these things in context. If you've got a real conflict at work, then there is resolution to that from that. But nobody should have to feel uncomfortable or that. But I do say, before you trigger that as your first action, do look inside and see if there's a role that you've got in it.
Yep. And I think with maturity comes that idea of pausing, right? You don't always have to have the answer immediately. And if the answer still feels true, right, and just, in a couple hours, well, then pick up the phone and have a conversation. So I think that's all really good advice. All right, guys. So we are at the top of the hour. We have about 8 minutes left. I just wanted to give anybody the opportunity to ask any questions before we pause. And I will ask you, Pam, to just share us, if anybody takes away anything at all from today's session, what would you hope that it would be?
I hope that you drive your career focusing on integrity and reputation. Okay. Because your integrity and reputation is what you take with you all the way. And if you follow those principles, you will look back and you'll be talking to the first sales guy or the first deal. My first deal I ever did, his birthday was on March 17th. It was my first $1 million deal. His name was Charlie Halleck. He worked at American General, which is now AIG. And I still talk to him, and he has great grandchildren. So those are the 2 points of you guide your journey, I would recommend.
Yes. And you never know where that network is going to come full circle. So admit kindness every step of the way, right? Every step of the way.
Hey guys, I raised $150,000 with the middle seat guy next to me on a plane for one of my companies. By the time we landed, I got $150,000. Okay. You never know who's sitting next to you.
Yes. Yes, that is no truer words have ever been spoken. That's so true. Well, guys, we are at the top of the hour for day 3. Thank you so much for everybody who tuned in. Feel free to leave some more questions. And tomorrow we'll be here at the same time, same place with Claude Silver, who's the Chief Heart Officer for Gary Vaynerchuk's company, VaynerX. So that'll be a really interesting topic. Another powerhouse woman who has a different lens, different perspective, different field, but still amidst the same, sentiment that we all have here, which is we need to all continue to raise each other up. So thank you so much for everybody who participated. Pam, thank you so much for always saying yes to these things. And we thank you so much for your time and wisdom.
Well, thank you. And anybody can reach out on LinkedIn. If you want cuddly advice, I'm probably not the person for you. But as Paula knows, I'm always happy to help anybody that's in her network. She is a rising star, and I can't wait when I'm sitting back looking at it and she's giving this advice to the next generation. Thank you, Paula.